Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have enjoyed your meal and your conversations. Introduce and please continue to enjoy your coffee or your drinks. And there's also dessert in the back if you haven't yet had a chance. Introducing this evening's keynote speaker will be Professor Thomas Cushman. Professor Cushman is the Defenbaugh de Hoyos Carlson Professor in the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at Wellesley College. In addition to serving as this conference's co-chair, he's also a distinguished visiting scholar in residence at the Eudamonia Institute for the entire academic year, 2018 to 2019. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cushman.
Thank you all for coming, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be a visiting fellow at the Eudamonia Institute this year. It's been a wonderful respite from my normal place of employment in order to focus on my research and my writing, and I wanted to thank Jim Otteson, especially Jim Otteson, and all the people at the Eudamonia Institute for their hospitality and their graciousness in being wonderful hosts. My job tonight is, and I want to be very quick because I want to have him have more say, my job is to introduce James Hunter. And I've been pondering for the last few days how I could possibly introduce James Hunter in a way that wasn't personal, wasn't extremely personal. James Hunter has been a mentor and a friend of mine for my entire career. I first met him as a graduate student at the University of Virginia, in which I was starving for theoretically inclined sociologists, and he came to give a job talk, and I loved the job talk, but many of the other people in the room did not love the job talk, and they came after him pretty fiercely, and he defended himself wonderfully. And it was a great lesson for me as a graduate student about how to go into a crowd which doesn't necessarily agree with you or understand what you're trying to talk about, and do battle with them and be a great and civil adversary. James Hunter was subsequently hired into the Department of Sociology, where he became a mentor and a friend who served on not only my master's thesis committee, but also my dissertation committee. And he's had a tremendous impact on my life. He had at that time been very involved in two things that are very important at this time in our time and place in our country. The study of the culture wars and the issue of civil religion. And at the time, James had been studying secular humanism as a religion. And eventually I came to understand that he was absolutely correct, that secular political ideas could be civil religion. And I ultimately wrote my dissertation on civil political religion in the Soviet Union. And his ideas fundamentally informed me and guided me throughout the whole time that I was a graduate student at the University of Virginia. I cannot think of a person that has been more influential in my thinking in sociology or in some of his other works and philosophical and theologically oriented works. His great book on Christian witnessing that he published, I believe it was 2010, had a tremendous influence on me at a time when I was going through a difficult period in my life. This is a sociologist who is truly one of the most important global sociologists of culture, but also a master at interdisciplinary understandings of modern culture, whether those understandings come from philosophy, theology, sociology, or any other field. I also want to say something personal. When I was a young graduate student, a master's student, I contracted a very serious disease. Nobody knew what it was. It was called, in medical terms, a fever of unknown origin. It's not a good diagnosis. And I was in the hospital, and because I had a fever of unknown origin, and no one knew what this fever was caused by, there were very many people that didn't visit me, with one exception, James Davison Hunter, who came to the hospital with this little girl and visited me when I was sick, very sick. It felt at the time as if mortally sick. And James came and proved to me that he was not just a mentor, an intellectual mentor, but also a Christian, a friend, and somebody who cared about other people. And throughout every period of my life, when I've asked for his help, when I've asked for his assistance, he has always been there. When I haven't asked for it, I've read his books and read his work and found inspiration in a person who always understood from the very beginning, from 20 to 30 years ago, the nature of the culture wars that are racking the United States. And there's never a time when I have not found his insights absolutely prescient and important for understanding the modern world. And I'd like to welcome my friend, my mentor, and my colleague, James Davison. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I should add, and still a disappointment to my mother. It's great to see Tom again, and great to see other friends, at least Don and Rob and Flo, who are so important to this university and this community. I am so grateful and honored to be here. I do want to thank the Hortons, Bill and Carissa Horton, for your generous support of this work. You'll see from my talks just how important I think this is. I want to thank Professor James Otteson, too, for leading this initiative, and Professor Hyde and Tom for inviting me. It's always a bit of a risk, it seems to me. And I'm just so very grateful for all who have made this event possible and for inviting me and welcoming me so warmly. I also am grateful for this institute, the Eudamonia Institute, in a context in which the good can no longer be assumed, taken for granted, where conceptions of eudaimonia are contested. A center like this provides an essential service. In most of the academic world, and certainly not in the political world, nowhere in these spaces will we find frank, open, honest discussion about the nature and meaning of human flourishing. So it's an honor, genuinely, to be a part of this discussion. So I want to address this question about human flourishing in the context of the new moral science and the larger question that the new moral science has sought to address. A field that has a long legacy about the relationship between science and the good, science and human flourishing, and in particular, the question, can science be the foundation for morality? Why is it important to understand this? Why should we care? For one, the fields that make up the new moral science, primatology, evolutionary psychology, neurochemistry, and the like, are all interesting, but mainly in the ways that scholars find these things interesting. It's esoteric, it's rarefied, often technical. This line of inquiry is not, on the face of it, the stuff of raucous public discussion. For another reason, the new moral science is also fairly marginal, on the fringes of mainstream disciplinary work. It's marginal or peripheral in philosophy, ethics, and even psychology. The third reason why you might think that this is an interesting topic to pursue is that the answer to its biggest claim, that science can be the foundation of morality, is pretty obvious. No, it can't. In philosophy, this question has been a mostly settled matter since 1739, when David Hume famously declared in his treatise of human nature that you can't get an ought from an is. For all of these reasons, the new moral science would seem to be safe to ignore. And yet there are reasons to pause before rejecting it. First, the answer to the question, can science be the foundation of morality, may seem obvious, but the question has been posed and its answer pursued in an ongoing way for 4 centuries by some of the most celebrated figures in Western philosophy. Beginning with Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, through Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, to David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. The answer may be obvious, but the question won't go away. For another, advocates of the new moral science make some very big claims. Let me read to you some of the titles of their works. The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values. The Ethical Brain, The Science of Our Moral Dilemmas. The Biological Basis of Morality. Rational Morality, A Science of Right and Wrong. The Moral Molecule, The Source of Love and Prosperity. Moral Minds, How Nature Designed Our Universal Sense of Right and Wrong. Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. And Hardwired Behavior, What Neuroscience Reveals About Morality. It is the philosophical foundations, moreover, of positive psychology, character education, and important streams of behavioral economics. Advocates also have a very big stage: best-selling books, access to millions of dollars of grant money, millions of TED Talk hits, prominent places at the Aspen Ideas Festival, prominent positions in major universities. On the other side, this approach, this line of inquiry, has spawned a legacy of reaction from luminaries as prominent as Weber, Spengler, Wittgenstein, C.S. Lewis, and others. And the reaction tells us something. So the story I want to tell about the quest to establish a scientific footing for morality plays out at 2 levels, as text and subtext. The text is on the surface, the actual philosophical and scientific activity in this area of inquiry. And here we find a fairly prosaic, even dull academic field, like most of academia, if we're honest, in which scholars look at brain imagery, or as they observe capuchin monkeys in the wild, as they protect and care for their young, or consider the patterns of insects cooperating to survive. That's the text. The subtext is below the surface and mostly implicit, entailing the larger cultural work the discourse of the new moral science is actually doing. Here we find a story that goes to the heart of Western modernity, a story that reveals its genealogy, its cultural logic, and where that cultural logic takes us. This evening, I want to tell bits of this story alternating between text and subtext. Why does a question that is seemingly settled by the best minds of Western philosophy keep coming back? So, I'll begin with the origins of this quest and what it tells us about its persistence. Then I want to talk about the new moral science itself, what we can safely conclude about it, and I'll spend most of my time here. Thirdly, I want to reflect on the larger meaning of the new moral science in the late modern world, and then I'll conclude. So that's my agenda. Begin with the genealogy, the origin, talk about the new moral science itself and what we can safely conclude, and then thirdly, reflect upon the larger meaning. So let me begin with the genealogy. At its core, the quest to find a scientific footing for morality emerges out of the problems of the late medieval and early modern period. And there were 2 problems in particular. The first problem was the problem of conflict and the suffering that followed in the wake of deep cultural difference. The second problem it was responding to was the disorder and confusion that followed from the massive complexity of modern knowledge and information. On the first problem, how in fact do we live together with our deepest differences? Differences that are often, if not always, moral in character. The culture war leaves us at an impasse that is not healthy for our democracy. Can we find a way through it? That's the contemporary rendering of that problem. But it was a problem, again, very much present in the early modern period. On the second problematic, can we find clear and simple wisdom or truth in the midst of the tsunami of contradictory knowledge and information that floods our lives? We now live in an age of information superabundance. It's often noted that more information has been produced in the last 30 years than in the previous 5,000 years. To make this concrete, the weekday edition of the New York Times contains more information than the average person in the 17th century England was likely to come across in their entire lifetime. Honestly, in the midst of all of that, what is justice? Fairness, equity. And if we can't agree on shared principles or ideals in their application, on what grounds do we adjudicate our differences of opinion over these matters? Some see science as the only method that offers any hope of being such a rational arbiter of these very difficult questions. After all, the methods of science, observation, experimentation, theory building, have delivered a persuasive picture of the physical universe grounded in universal consensus in the physical sciences, despite wide-ranging cultural differences of its practitioners. Chemists from Iran and chemists from France come from entirely different cultures, but they still agree upon the periodic table. Chinese physicists and Norwegian physicists also come from completely different worlds, but they agree upon the same laws of motion. And so we arrive at this bright thought. Perhaps science can do for morality what it has done for physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics, and the technologies which are based upon them. Can the methods of science provide rational and compelling answers to questions of right and wrong, good and bad, and how we ought to live? Can science be the foundation of morality? That hope takes us to early modern Europe, a time and a place of significant social, political, economic, cultural, and intellectual change. The changes were comprehensive, but the most visible changes were the fissures in the Holy Roman Empire that blossomed into the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the divisions of Europe into political and religious microstates, which in turn escalated into numerous European wars from the early 16th century through the middle of the 17th century. The 30 Years' War and the French Wars of Religion are well-known events, but what is sometimes forgotten is how bloody these conflicts were. Killing in God's name produced huge death tolls. Upwards to 4 million people out of a total regional population of 16 million were killed during the 37 years of the French Wars of Religion. And 7 million died as a result of the 30 Years' War out of a population of 20 million. In all, the wars of religion claimed between 1/3 and 1/4 of those living in Western Europe, and few families escaped those casualties. So the urgency to ameliorate such gratuitous destruction was palpable, and it was palpable to everyone. It's in this context that the question, can science provide a foundation for morality, is first posed and gains traction. But this technical question actually conceals a more profound question. Namely, Can science rise above all of the differences that divide us and cut through the complexity of knowledge and information that characterizes the modern world to become the foundation of a just and humane social order? Against the epic failure of religion in the early modern period to provide a unifying and peaceable solution to the problems of difference and complexity, can science, in effect, provide an alternative magisterium, authority, upon which human flourishing could be established? It is no accident that all of the moral scientists of the early modern period were also well-known and influential political theorists. They understood that the possibilities of a liberalizing political order rested upon the authority of a cultural order that provided basic and shared understandings about the nature of a good and just society. If a political order couldn't rest upon religion, then the only conceivable alternative at that time was right reason, for which science was the final authority. Science would have to do what religion had not done, and so far as they could tell, could not do. It's this deeper question about the nature and foundation of a just and humane social order that animates the 400-year quest to establish a science of human flourishing. What is at stake is the yearning to coherently address some of the knottiest problems of the modern world, not least, how and upon what foundation do we build a good and just and flourishing society? The actual story of this 400-year quest is a story of brave and creative efforts spanning centuries, marked by many promising ideas, cycles of dormancy and revival, but also failure after failure after failure. By the beginning of the 20th century, there was a decided turning away from this quest. Evolutionary ethics had all but died out, and while utilitarianism was still regarded as a viable philosophical theory, it had also fragmented into different ideas of the right criteria for determining right from wrong. Moreover, logical positivism, which was popular in the day, had concluded that moral claims were not empirically verifiable and therefore were meaningless. But by the mid-1970s, the quest revived. The pill that revived the science of morality was found while trying to resolve a long-standing puzzle in evolutionary biology. For much of the 20th century, it was commonplace among evolutionary theorists that natural selection would favor the survival and reproduction of those individual organisms that behaved selfishly. The question that nagged at evolutionary theorists was how to explain the development of the tendency in some animals to behave altruistically, to act in ways that are not in their individual best interests for survival and reproduction. Biologist E.O. Wilson published his groundbreaking book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, in 1975. In it, he used the research of recent decades showing how social behavior depended on evolutionarily developed genetic factors to suggest an answer to the altruism question. And here it is. While natural selection favored selfishness in individuals, it favored altruism in groups. Most of Wilson's book concerned the genetic basis of insect social behavior, but in a few places he extended the thesis to human beings. He claimed that the time, and I quote, "the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of the philosophers and biologized." Wilson thought that the evolutionary explanation for the development of human behavior would prove far more fruitful for the study of morality than traditional philosophy and philosophical ethics had ever been. Wilson's hypothesis was problematic and controversial. It was rejected widely by many, and yet it laid the groundwork for a fundamental reorientation of the quest to find a scientific foundation for morality. And it did so by bringing together hypotheses and evidence from different fields to explain how complex social behaviors and psychological impulses could have evolved. By the 1990s, the new moral science emerged as a new synthesis that combined David Hume's mind-focused sentimentalism, Darwin's evolutionary account of the mind, and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, all embedded within a naturalism committed to empirical study of the mind. This configuration of views now appears to be more or less standard across disciplines studying the mind and is common in scientific or scientifically informed approaches to morality. What has further contributed to this revival has been new technologies that offer deeper and more detailed empirical observations of the brain itself. The flurry of activity that has followed has generated considerable excitement. And yet, through the fog, there are at least 4 solid conclusions that we can make. The first conclusion is that after centuries of looking, and for all of the fanfare surrounding the new moral science, the quest has, at best, delivered modest results and only of a descriptive nature. For example, moral foundations theory has described some basic and important moral emotions. Evolutionary biology and primatology have uncovered promising mechanisms that illuminate how other regarding behavior could have evolved. And neurochemistry has described some of the physical mechanisms involved in moral thought and action. But at its best, these remain descriptive analogs of prescriptive moral concepts. All of this effort has not brought us any closer to a consensus-making scientific account of morality. It has failed to deliver on the long-standing hope for a scientific grounding for morality. That's the first conclusion. The second conclusion is that the failure of the new moral science to deliver on the promise comes down to 2 fundamental challenges, basic and internal to science itself. These are the challenges of definition and demonstration. The challenge of definition is the challenge of providing a clear and concise definition of morality that is adequate to lived experience. So let me give an example. In a recent book, biologist David Sloan Wilson argued that science can demonstrate that altruism exists. There are 2 different senses of altruism at play in his argument. One is prescriptive, and the other is descriptive. One is ethically intended, the other is biologically elucidated. In biology, altruism means that one organism's increasing another organism's reproductive fitness at a cost to its own. This stands in contrast with an ethical understanding of altruism, where the idea is framed in terms of one's acting with the intent of benefiting another, without regard for the cost to oneself. Unfortunately, Wilson abandons the ethically relevant understanding of altruism in favor of a more empirically tractable behavioral definition. And toward the end of the book, he makes this redefinition explicit. And I quote, "Altruism exists," he says. "If by altruism we mean traits that evolve by virtue of benefiting whole groups, despite being selectively disadvantageous within groups, then altruism indubitably exists and accounts for group-level functional organization that we see in nature." End quote. So this account takes us far from any recognizable prescriptive definition of altruism. Wilson is aware of this, but he's not concerned. His book, he argues, and I quote again, "Once the existence of altruism hinges on distinctions among motives, It becomes difficult to study because motives are less transparent than actions. But to the degree that different psychological motives result in the same actions, we shouldn't care much about distinguishing among them, any more than we should care about being paid with a cash or by a check. It's not right to privilege altruism as a psychological motive when other equivalent motives exist. So, and that's an end quote. So Wilson claims that satisfying the biological, behavioristic definition of altruism is really all that matters. As he put it, it doesn't matter whether he gets paid in cash or by a check. But when you think about it, that's far from evident. Do you really only care that your spouse acts as though she loves you? That she says complimentary things to you? That she appears to enjoy conversation with you? That she contributes income to the family, says things a loving spouse should say, appears to be sexually attracted to you, and remembers your birthday? What if you discovered that she does all of these things without feeling anything for you? Or worse, she does all of these things while secretly detesting you? Would Wilson claim that this is just a cash or check situation? Just as so long as she's doing all the observable things she would do if she really did love you, then the underlying motives, intentions, and desires are irrelevant? Such a relationship would be functional, but loveless, missing precisely the element that makes acts genuinely altruistic. Wilson's definition of the key moral term in his study ultimately renders his account at best incoherent and possibly irrelevant to a science of altruism as lived and experienced. This is the common outcome for scientific accounts that falter on the challenge of definition. The second challenge is the challenge of demonstration, the challenge of constituting morality in ways that are scientifically measurable. So let's take the example of happiness. Let's leave aside the variable way that happiness is understood historically, which is a definitional problem. It's compounded by a demonstration problem. The empirical part of the science of happiness relies upon respondents' self-reported levels of subjective positive emotion, which specify along a single metric of how satisfied they are with their lives. The demonstration problem is that there is no objective or natural unit by which we can measure happiness. What people actually mean by happiness or satisfaction is not known, and therefore cannot be meaningfully compared from one person to another or from one time to another. The challenge of demonstration looms larger still. Suppose, for the sake of argument, we could measure happiness in a meaningful way. Suppose we could calculate the presence and degree of people's subjective positive feelings, their deep engagement, how meaningful they take their lives to be, the positivity of their relationships and their accomplishments. Would this tell us about morality? By itself, nothing. For these data to have relevance to questions of morality, we would have to know that subjective positive feelings, deep engagement, and the like are ethically good or are worth pursuing. But no empirical technique yet known can uncover that. Those surveys that measure subjective happiness may tell us in a very approximate way people's levels of positive emotion or life satisfaction, but the ethical relevance of these properties is beyond the scope of those studies. As Martha Nussbaum put it, and I quote, "Pleasure is only as good as the thing that one takes pleasure in. If one takes pleasure in harming others, that good feeling emotion is very negative. Even if one takes pleasure in shirking one's duties and lazing around, that is also quite negative. If one feels hope, that emotion is good only if it is based upon accurate evaluations of the worth of what one hopes for and true beliefs about what is likely." End quote. As we say, there is no way to scientifically demonstrate the goodness or the value of the ends to which happiness is directed. In the end, the challenge of definition and of demonstration operate at cross purposes. The more morality is defined in an empirically measurable way, the less it resembles morality as it seems to be. And the more faithful the definition of morality is to experience, the less it is empirically measurable. The third conclusion is that within the discourse of the new moral science, there is a pervasive tendency to overreach, even among the most sophisticated practitioners. Now, some of the blame for this goes to the overzealous and sensationalist packaging by media reports of sober scientific work. But the practitioners, too, sometimes overreach. And let me give you an example of a notable and rather reckless attempt to leverage modest scientific findings into substantive moral conclusions. In a short paper in Nature, highly regarded scientific journal, in 2005, a team of 5 scientists described their finding that spritzing oxytocin into the noses of test subjects correlated with increased trust in interpersonal interactions. The paper noted that part of the interest of the study was that it seemed to shed some light on the mostly unknown biological basis of trust in human beings. Its significance was not lost on other scientists interested in neurobiology of human social behavior, and soon the paper had thousands of citations. But what really pushed this study into the spotlight were the efforts by one of the 5 original authors, Paul J. Zak, a neuroeconomist at Claremont Graduate Center. He began to pitch his research to a much broader audience, kicking off with a popular TED Talk and moving on to multiple web articles, culminating with his 2012 book, The Moral Molecule, The Source of Love and Prosperity. In The Moral Molecule, he argues, and I quote, that a single molecule, and by the way, a chemical substance that scientists like me can manipulate in the lab, accounts for why some people give freely of themselves and others are cold-hearted bastards. Why some people cheat and steal and others you can trust with your life. Why some husbands are faithful than others, more faithful than others, and by the way, why women tend to be more generous and nicer than men. There's never been any doubt that moral thought is linked to behavior by some physical means. Perhaps oxytocin figures into this causal process. But where does it figure, especially with respect to moral judgment and character? Does oxytocin cause moral judgment? Or does moral judgment cause or influence oxytocin release? In order to legitimately claim that oxytocin is the major factor explaining morality, Zak would need to answer these sorts of questions, but he makes little effort to do so. Without being able to show how oxytocin figures in the broader explanatory framework of moral thought and action, he's in the position of someone trying to tell us that what explains drunk driving accidents is the presence of alcohol in driver's blood. That's not enlightening. But Zak's case for the relevance of oxytocin in explaining morality is even weaker than that. 5 attempts to replicate the original trust game study that jump-started Zak's project have failed to produce similar results. And in fact, additional research has suggested that under some conditions, oxytocin promotes aggression and defensiveness, emotions directly opposed to the cuddly ones that Zak describes. In sum, Zak's moral molecule project promised to identify the central mechanism of human love, morality, and prosperity, but what he delivers is little more than a slick misrepresentation of modest results that have yet to meet basic scientific standards of replication. This is just one instance of overreach, but even when moral scientists stop short of overreaching, they often rely upon blurred boundaries to exploit the interest in substantive moral science. The fourth conclusion is that the new moral science today is actually engaged in a very different project from the one that was pursued historically. Today's moral scientists no longer look to science to discover moral truths, for they believe that there is nothing there to discover. As they see it, there are no such things as prescriptive moral or ethical norms. There are no moral oughts or obligations. There is no ethical good, bad, or objective value of any kind. What is confusing is that the language of morality is preserved. The new moral science still speaks of what we should and should not do, but the meaning has been changed. Normative guidance is now about achieving certain practical ends. Given that we want this or that, what should we do in order to obtain it? The quest then has been fundamentally redirected. The science of morality is no longer about discovering how we ought to live, though it is still often presented as such. Rather, it is now concerned with exploiting scientific and technological know-how in order to achieve practical goals grounded in whatever social consensus we can justify. The science of morality then has evolved into an engineering project rooted in morally arbitrary goals. Because genuine good, bad, right, and wrong have been jettisoned, there is no finally known basis upon which to adjudicate in any principled way which end should be pursued. Of course, no one is saying that we are free to adopt any goals or objectives we please. And in their various policy or behavioral proposals, the new moral scientists never fail to recommend those sanctioned by safe, liberal, humanitarian values. With concern, however, I would point out that from their own perspective, these values can boast of little more than the historically contingent support of present elites in Western society. By their own commitments, there can be no deeper good that anchors this consensus over any other place or time in world history. In the end, the new moral science leads to a kind of moral and ethical nihilism. So let me move to the penultimate argument here. Where does the new moral science leave us? One of the striking features of the new moral science is the effective absence of any working awareness of or engagement with history, culture, or political economy. Take as an example the centrality of social consensus in the new utilitarian logic. The absence of any mind-independent moral values means that it's necessary to rely upon the shared values of social consensus to build an ethics, that ethics begins with what the people want. Surely we should be cautious about that idea. After all, social consensus in the 1930s, Germany gave us a democratically elected Nazi party, the Third Reich and its war machine, and in turn the horrors of the Holocaust. Social consensus gave us a democratically validated slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, the terror of lynching, and every conceivable expression of social denigration and discrimination. Social consensus gave us apartheid in South Africa, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and genocide in Armenia, Darfur, and Rwanda. These events were not merely imposed on unwilling populations by fanatical autocrats. Rather, they were embraced by the people, and the ideas that led to them were woven into their cultures as established social practices, reproduced by the formal and informal socialization practices of those cultures. The shared values of social consensus can yield abhorrent results. But to make such comparisons and to see their implications, one must have an elementary concept of institutions or of society. But the new moral science gives us no such concepts. The social world in all of its complexity is simply the sum of individuals motivated by their particular interests in order to sustain or increase personal and individual well-being. Precisely because the new moral science has no adequate conception of the social, it has no conceptualization of human goods outside of mutually agreed upon individual mental states. Public goods have no existence outside of individual subjectivity, no ontology, no transcendence against which the self would be held to account. How then, within the framework of the new moral science, is one to make ethical sense of the threats to our global environment, to liberty from the expanding surveillance capacities of the state, to the economy from fraud in the banking sector, to justice from the corruption of political, civic, and corporate leadership? How is one to make sense of the sacrifice necessary to achieve social justice? The new moral science provides no categories for comprehending, much less addressing questions of collective moral failure or aspiration. What about happiness and well-being? The prima facie case against happiness as a scientifically useful concept I've already laid out, and I think it's very strong. People find subjective well-being in as many different sources as one can imagine. What could be more variable? Middle-aged introspective academics, Nepalese Sherpas, horny American teenagers, religiously observant Jews, Kalahari Bushmen, Tibetan monks, members of a biker gang, construction workers, ISIS fighters, and so on and so on. All find happiness in different ways. What is the happiness that they share in common? Except for the word itself, what common currency of utilitarian exchange could permit us to resolve conflict and to pursue justice? People may also find subjective well-being within regimes the new moral scientists would certainly regard as evil. We know, for example, that the years spent in the Hitler Youth were among the happiest of the lives of the 7.3 million young Nazis because they found there camaraderie, fellowship, common purpose, and opportunities to grow, develop, and work together. Well, that was the social consensus. In the end, happiness as it is understood today is a highly subjective category, mostly reflecting the historically contingent cultural consensus of late modern Western middle and upper middle class liberalism. It is doubtful that many citizens of Tehran, Soweto, Beijing, or the blighted areas of Detroit, LA, or Washington share that consensus. The question then will seem rhetorical, but given the world that we live in, it is both justifiable and vital to ask, would the civil rights movement in the United States have achieved its successes through the kinds of utilitarian consensus that Joshua Green, for example, speaks of? Would apartheid in South Africa have ended because people worked through the calculations of shared happiness? And could everyday heroism, such as caring for an elderly parent or a severely disabled child over many, many years, or providing a kidney for a stranger needing a transplant, be achieved and sustained through the rational calculation of costs and benefits? Against the moral differences at the root of the modern world's conflicts and the new moral science as currently defined, these claims seem utterly banal. Absent an engagement with history and culture and the humanities and religious traditions, the new moral science appears impoverished, superficial, even trite. The new moral science simply cannot bear the weight of our age's moral concerns. So in conclusion, why does this question keep coming back? Can science become the foundation of morality, settled, but it keeps coming back? It comes back because against the failure of religion to provide a stable foundation for human flourishing, we don't know where else to go. Yet for all that science has taught us, and for all the good that science has brought about, it has clearly not provided anything like a solution to the problem of human flourishing, or of morality, or of the good. No way of resolving moral disagreements through empirical methods. But where the new moral science fails as a science, it succeeds as an ideology for a managerial and technocratic elite that has no other vocabulary to justify its exercise of power. The new moral science. The central issue isn't moral truth, it's moral solidarity for a technocratic regime that has no other source of legitimation. These facts make the work of the Eudamonia Institute here at Wake Forest University more urgent than ever. Thank you very much.